He's been here before, the former head of the Rhode Island Progressive Democrats of America, now newly declared candidate for Rhode Island Senate District 5. Sam Bell, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you so much for inviting me in.
Well, it's the big official kickoff day.
Yes, it is.
The campaign is launched. We are in full election season right now.
Indeed.
How long have you been mulling over this run for?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say a couple of months. Yeah, it's been, I've thought about the possibility of running for office for a little while. I've been, for a long time, when I first got involved in politics here, I was upset about the Tea Party. I was concerned about what was happening to our country, the national level. And then I came and I found out what was happening here in Rhode Island. And I was really horrified. And, my mother raised me to be a Democrat. I had basic, an understanding that we should have a Democratic Party that fights for everyone, that fights for fundamental, basic democratic values. And what I saw here in Rhode Island was a party where most of the Democrats in the state Senate, including the incumbent in this race, are endorsed by Right to Life, where the top Democrats in the House and the Senate were taking thousands of dollars of money from the NRA, where when we cut taxes for the rich, we cut the top income tax rate by so much. The only state in the country that's cut it by more is North Dakota.
So we've talked before about the differentiation between the Democrats here in the state. And one of the stories actually GoLocal had written was Governor Raimondo taking money from the top NRA lobbyist, William Murphy. How big is the rift between, as you call them, the conservative Democratic element and where you see the progressive Democrats going?
I think that there are fundamental differences. And what I think is really exciting, people always tell us that, we've taken on some difficult fights here in Rhode Island. I remember when we first started fighting for gun control. After Newtown, I was absolutely heartbroken. It was so devastating to watch 20 children mowed down and to know that we could be passing policies that would do something about that and make that never happen.
Tell viewers, really what that you had been pushing for at that time.
At that moment, I remember there was a gun control movement that I was very happy to be part of that came together right after Newtown. And what we did was we put together, there were a whole bunch of proposals, and they all went down. There was at that point people were talking about an assault weapons ban, which was the right policy because it would have stopped it. And the reason everything went down, I remember the first time I thought about taking on this fight, I remember standing in the parking lot of Atlantic Mills after an ONA meeting, and a friend of mine who'd been an activist for a while, I asked her, why can we never take on gun control in the state? And she told me it's because all the top leaders in the Democratic Party are taking money from the NRA. And so after that first legislative session after Newtown where we got nothing done, I tried to figure out where the money came from. And I started an investigation, and it turns out that it was all being illegally funneled in from the national NRA.
You had a huge role, yes, in this investigation.
Right, and ultimately we got their illegal funding stream shut down. We got them slapped with a $63,000 fine, which was second highest in state history. And since that happened, since the illegal money stream from the NRA stopped, we've finally been able to pass some incremental gun control legislation. I just came here from the launch of the assault weapons ban campaign, which I'm really excited about, and I think that we really finally are going to be able to pass real gun control in the state. But people have always told me it's a battle you can never win. And I've heard that time and time again. I remember when we launched the Stop the Stadium Deal campaign, when they wanted to move McCoy Stadium to the downtown waterfront park on the I-95 land. People told us that there's no way that you can possibly win. But so many Rhode Islanders stood up and said no, and volunteered, collected signatures, knocked on doors, went to rallies, that we won.
Round one. Now, what are your thoughts on round two with Apex?
I think that this new deal is not a good deal. I don't think it's quite as bad as the original deal, but I still think it's misguided. There are a lot of things that really we should work out that are just not worked out in the current deal. So for instance, I'm very concerned. I think the lesson that we should have learned from McCoy is when you don't fix the roof, it does rain in the state of Rhode Island, and if you don't fix the roof, you will get massive water damage. And you cannot sign a stadium deal that does not have enough money in there for maintenance to replace the roof. And this current deal has $4.5 million over 30 years without any adjustment for inflation. That's not even enough to basically replace the roof. Under this current deal, exactly what happened at McCoy is going to happen again. We're not going to be able to replace the roof, it will leak, and there will be massive water damage. And we need to be able to get these basics right. I also think from just the amount of money they're asking for is unprecedented. Compared to the most recent deal in a comparable league, the Charlotte Knights deal, it's outrageous how much more money they're asking for. But I think that ultimately this is probably going to go down because we created a movement in the state where people will stand up and say no to corporate welfare. But I think that the fight that we really need to take on is the fight to resist the Trump agenda. I remember after that election, I was more beaten down than I've ever been. I've seen a lot of things in politics, but nothing hit me like that. That night was the only night I ever smoked a cigarette in my life. Drank more than I really should have. Drank more than I have since, to be honest. And I go to work for months after, just stare at the screen, and it was bad. But I realized that we needed to take on the fight to resist the Trump agenda here in Rhode Island.
And the event last weekend up at the State House, there was the no president is above the law. What do you have to say to folks who shoot back maybe from the other side and say, the economy's fine, what's your issue?
I think if you look at what Trump tried to do, the first part of his agenda that he really tried to push hard was slashing Medicaid by repealing Obamacare. And Democrats stood up and we protested, we said no, we resisted, and we defeated his Medicaid cuts. And so because of that, we did not see the economic pain that they would have brought to this country. But here in Rhode Island, we have in budget after budget slashed Medicaid. We saw Memorial Hospital close, provider after provider has closed down, and the healthcare system that serves our neediest Rhode Islanders is in a real crisis. And we have to stand up, and I believe that we can take on the fight just like we did at the national level. We defeated the Medicaid cuts at the national level, and we can defeat this core element of the Trump agenda right here in Rhode Island. The second part of the Trump agenda that he really pushed hard was tax cuts for the rich. And I believe we can take that fight on here. Rhode Island has cut taxes for the rich more than any state except for North Dakota. And I believe that, yes, we can take on the fight to repeal the tax cuts for the rich. Ever since the biggest tax cut for the rich in 2006, we have faced budget crisis after budget crisis. And we need the space to be able to say, enough is enough, let's repeal the tax cuts for the rich so we can talk about where to invest, not where to cut.
So that was going to be my question. When you talk about trying to maintain adequate Medicaid services, there's a price tag, and your answer to that is revisit the tax cuts.
I also think that, and we never talk about this, but in Rhode Island, Medicaid is privatized. That's not normal. I think that we should convert Medicaid to a true single-payer system. We do not need to waste the amount of money that we spend on privatizing the system. And so there is real waste in Medicaid in Rhode Island, and it's the money that we pay to private insurance companies to administer it instead of having a publicly run single-payer system. So I do believe that there is space to restructure the Medicaid budget, but we should invest that money in care and repealing the Medicaid cuts. The final part of the Trump agenda, I think it's really important that we take on here in our state, has been a legacy of horrifying racism that Trump has brought to our country. And here in Rhode Island, there are things that we need to do. In our city, in Providence, we have a legacy of deeply segregationist housing policy. And it is time that we join the rest of other blue states in banning segregated luxury housing. Most cities and towns do not allow this, but here in Rhode Island, instead of subsidizing affordable housing, we subsidize the kind of segregated luxury housing that isn't legal in Boston. It isn't legal in New York.
What do you think of DARE's rent control campaign here in the city, trying to get that on the ballot for the city of Providence?
I think when you look at rent control, it can sometimes have a positive effect in the short run, but it doesn't really fully address the problem. The problem is in the overall market, and I really don't think rent control goes far enough in combating our affordable housing crisis. The problem is that we simply do not subsidize affordable housing. Instead, we only subsidize luxury housing. We spend less than 1/10 per capita what Massachusetts spends on affordable housing. We can change that. And, I think it's really best to look at the overall market instead of just setting a couple price controls, which will help a little bit, but it doesn't take us nearly far enough. And so I don't think that it really goes far enough. But there are other things that we need to do to combat a legacy of racism in our state. And one of the things I strongly disagree with the incumbent on is mass incarceration. He's the guy who sponsored the criminal gangs bill, which slaps 10 years on your sentence if the cops decide without due process that you're part of a criminal gang. And you can be arrested for a year, have a sentence, and then go to jail for 11. And it is time that we combat a legacy of mass incarceration in our state. And I believe it is time to stand up and say, yes, we have to take on the prison industrial complex, we have to end the school to prison pipeline, and it's time to take on these fights in Rhode Island.
So speaking of battles, here we are 2018, there is a marijuana legalization study commission still currently underway. Did you think that Rhode Island would be at this point in 2018?
I have often been cynical and I guess realistic is probably the word about the state of our politics right now. The legislature doesn't share the same kind of basic democratic values that the legislatures in other blue states do. And so we are really at a risk of being an island of prohibition here. Marijuana is going to be regulated and taxed and legally bought in the state of Massachusetts, the state of Vermont. It looks like pretty soon in the state of Connecticut. And we really risk being an island of prohibition. And plenty of Rhode Islanders will drive 5 minutes, 10 if they're following the speed limits, to Massachusetts and buy weed, take it back illegally, and smoke plenty of weed. But what we're not going to be able to do is to regulate it properly, to take care of health outcomes. We're going to certainly lose all the jobs that would go to Rhode Island. And I think the biggest problem is we need to treat drugs as a public health issue. We do not need to approach drugs by criminalizing them. And if we remain an island of prohibition, we're not going to have the ability to do what we need to about public health here in Rhode Island. I think that's a real travesty. I think it's time that the legislature act. But I am not optimistic about the prospects for this year unless we elect new people who are going to change how the legislature operates.
Island of prohibition, let's talk about the governor's proposal for sports betting to fill the budget hole. What was your response to that in her budget proposal?
My concern here is twofold. On the one hand, I think that when we invest in gambling, we always have to worry about gambling that targets low-income communities. And here in Rhode Island, I was very proud to oppose the Tiverton Casino proposal because I don't think it's the right kind of gambling. I thought that it designed specifically to target problem gamblers and specifically to target low-income communities. Sports betting is not quite as problematic in that aspect, but it still has some problems when it comes to gambling addiction. And I don't think we want to look at this as a revenue source. We want to look at it as the right way to regulate it, and we don't want to try and squeeze as much money as possible. I'm also concerned about the constitutionality of this proposal. I think that it is unclear that it is legal without consulting the voters of the state of Rhode Island. And so it puts us at risk that if we balance the budget on the back of a proposal that might well get struck down in the courts, it's dangerous because then we might find ourselves in a difficult situation where all of a sudden the budget is tens of millions of dollars out of whack. And so I think it is important that if the legislature proceeds with this proposal, they obtain an advisory opinion from the Supreme Court of Rhode Island to ensure that it is constitutional, and I really urge them to take that step, because if not, there is a real risk, and I think it is important that we figure out whether or not we do need to consult the people of Rhode Island. I would also say that as just a as just a basic idea, it is probably worth asking the people of Rhode Island. There's no reason to err on the side of not consulting with the people.
So it's interesting. I don't know the legal precedent of, waiting to see at the federal level from SCOTUS how they rule on sports betting. Does that need to be decided before it's decided here? But then it's also contained in the budget. So it's almost as though we have to wait and see what happens federally, but then could we be past the point of no return? I don't know if they can do it concurrently.
Right. Well, the other thing I'm asking about is the state constitution.
Yes.
We have a provision in the state constitution that the people of Rhode Island have to be consulted when we expand gambling. And it is unclear to me. I think that with sports betting, the law is not clear. I'm not going to say it's unconstitutional. I'm not going to say it's constitutional. I think this is a case where the law is vague and unclear, and it is necessary that we find clarity before we move forward.
Oh, you're right. There's two channels. There's federal and the state as well.
And the other thing I'd say about this is when Twin River was set up, some of the money from Twin River went to the Narragansett. And we set a precedent that if we weren't going to allow our Native American tribes to control gambling, we were going to give them some revenue to support all the important programs that they do. When the Tiverton Casino came forward, which was on Wampanoag land, none of the money went to the newly reorganized Wampanoag community. And I think that was a problem, and I'm concerned that with this new sports betting proposal, none of the revenue is going to support our Native American community here in Rhode Island. And I think that we need to talk about, and it goes back to the legacy of systemic racism. The state has not treated Native American populations with any semblance of ethics. Even in recent years, there have been horrible, horrible things like the smokehouse raid. And I would go so far as to say the way that the state police handled the recent elections dispute. I think that it was not right for the state of Rhode Island to step into that elections dispute in the way that they did.
And remind viewers about
So
this.
there was a heavily disputed election for the Narragansett tribe. And there were allegations of a coup. And the state essentially backed the sitting leadership, which it had been alleged essentially had more or less stolen an election. So there were allegations, and it was a heavy dispute, and I think the state did not handle it in the most sensitive way. But I do think that it's crucial going forwards when we talk about gambling revenue that we remember that we need to invest in Native American communities because we do not allow them to control gambling on their own, as many states do. The state essentially has a monopoly for private businesses that have nothing to do with the tribes. And we should spend some of the revenue on.
We'll see what happens with the gaming proposal moving forward. Finally, while I have you in here, Sam, one of the things that we've seen in recent months is we do know the candidate survey from the Progressive Democrats of America asking candidates if they would support current leadership, House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello. Do you think that is the litmus test for someone who says I'm running as a progressive Democrat?
I think it's the litmus test. I have spoken out, and I think it's no secret that I'm critical of the House Speaker. I believe that his values are very different from the Democratic parties. He said Rhode Island should be supportive of Trump, and I don't agree with that. I think that that progressives should take a strategy that combats his leadership when he does things that are incorrect. And I think that we should have the courage to stand up to powerful leaders like the Speaker. And I do believe sometimes, one of the things that happens in the State House is there's this culture where you're not supposed to vote your conscience. You're just supposed to vote along with the leadership. And one of the things I do appreciate about the Senate leadership is that they have not maintained the same culture. So in the Senate, and I think it's a really healthy thing, and I'm really pleased that the new Senate leadership is encouraging this more, I think it's great for people to vote their conscience. And I do believe that extends to leadership votes.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm glad that I got you in here today on the official kickoff day. Sam Bell running for Rhode Island Senate District 5, Sam, I'm sure we'll hear more from you moving forward as election season is in full swing. So I appreciate you taking the time to come in today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I'll let you go around the corner. We'll see you soon. Sam Bell, former head of the Rhode Island Progressive Democrats of America, announced today running for Rhode Island Senate seat in District 5. So appreciate him taking the time to come in here to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. So that just about wraps up another day here in downtown Providence on GoLocal Live. Molly O'Brien was up at 3. Be sure to check out her show. We'll be back tomorrow at 3 o'clock with The Taste, all things food and drink here in Rhode Island. I'll be back at 4 with news and politics. Stay tuned for more news, politics, lifestyle, and sports on GoLocalProv.com. Catch us on Facebook, but we'll catch you back here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center tomorrow. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.